And welcome back. I'm Marcus Pete. I'm joined by a friend. We've known each other for some years now, Dr. John Pinheiro, historian, director of research and publications at Acton Institute. And we are going to be talking about some of the sources behind the Declaration of Independence, but also the thought process of different systems of government between Hamilton and Jefferson. John, thank you for joining us. How are you?
Oh, I'm happy. Well, today I'm tired. We're at Acton University, and as you know, it's all day long and all night long, and it's a lot of fun. 4 days of learning and fun. But I'm happy to be on your show.
Oh, well, always happy to reconnect with you, my friend. Okay, so we're going to jump right into it because, you know, as usual, the segments are short, but these topics are so crucial. Before we talk about the sources behind the Declaration, I want to talk about, you know, when we throw around these terms, and you're a faithful Catholic too, so we've got the bearing of faith here. When we throw around these terms about the Hamiltonian versus the Jeffersonian paradigm for government, our listeners have heard this before. What are we talking about?
Well, this has been going on for 2 centuries now, though. That is shorthand to understand different ways of viewing what the American Republic should look like. And should it look like a commercial republic? That would be the Hamiltonian side. Or should it look like this agrarian republic of small farmers? This kind of idealized agrarian version that Jefferson promoted. And so the shorthand is this, that Thomas Jefferson realized, as anybody in favor of Republican that is representative government knew, that you needed a virtuous citizenry. That is, if we can't govern ourselves interiorly, then we can't govern outside ourselves. And the less we can govern ourselves in terms of virtue, the more we have to be governed, which means the bigger government gets and then the more tyrannical and bureaucratic it gets in the end. So who are the most virtuous people? Jefferson thought it was what he called the yeoman farmers because they were independent. They weren't employed by anybody. They weren't in debt to anybody. So most farmers are in debt because they're buying their seed for next year. They're buying the latest machinery. They're expanding acreage. But these were farmers who just wanted to live well, and they were free-holding farmers. So these are not the slave-holding farmers like Jefferson, for instance. It's a bit idealized. I mean, I come from a farm family, so I know how idealized this is exactly. But he thought that if you could maximize in the number of these yeoman farmers in your country, you would have those who could cast very honest votes. Because in those days, you went into a room, you raised your hand, and if the banker whom you owe money is standing on one side or the employer who holds your life in his hands is on the other side, you might not raise your hand when you wish you could, right? So these would be the most independent-minded. Hamilton, on the other hand, thought that was myopic, that you could have agriculture and industry in the same nation. So imagine a multifaceted economy. But that would also require, Hamilton realized, a national bank, some centralized industrial planning, protective tariffs to help small fledgling American industries grow. So, for instance, it was illegal during the British Empire to make clothing on any large scale in America. Jefferson even complained about this in one of those sources to the Declaration, that it's crazy, he said, that an American can't make his own hat on his own soil. But this was true under British law. So there wasn't a profitable textile industry in the United States until the 1830s. It took almost 50 years. It was so stunted. So Hamilton's argument, for that reason, but also for national security, national defense, I should say, was to build up the American industrial base. But that required credit from the British, who were a recent enemy. And so the concept was that you have this Jeffersonian agrarian small government vision against this big government industrial Hamiltonian vision. And so if we were to look at political parties, we would trace the Hamiltonian vision through the Federalists, then what was called the Whig Party, and finally the Republican Party of Abraham Lincoln. And the Jeffersonian side would be more the Democratic Republican Party than just the Democratic Party. But they haven't always tracked perfectly well with political parties. So you might think of the early 1980s and you would think of small government, and Ronald Reagan would talk about small government and Thomas Jefferson quite often. But you wouldn't think of, at least I wouldn't think of today's Republican Party as a small government party. We don't seem to have a small government party anymore in the United States, so that we have individuals who promote these ideas, certainly. And so they haven't always tracked perfectly well. The Democratic Party became very pro-industrial, and in terms of centralized planning from the top in the 1930s under Roosevelt.
Now, just so we are clear for the viewers and the listeners, we are not saying that the Hamiltonian perspective is an absolute a travesty, and nor are we saying
Correct.
that absolute good on the Jeffersonian side, but we are arguing that there really are merits to both that have in their tension shaped the way we think of the American Republic.
Yes, it's a healthy tension, and just about at every Acton University, I always give a talk on Hamilton versus Jefferson. I have it at this year's Acton University, and it's a healthy tension because we realize, for a market to work, there needs to be protections of private property, and to protect private property, then we also need laws and legal protections and some regulations. So neither of them is talking. Jefferson's not talking about anarcho-capitalism, and Hamilton certainly isn't talking about the kind of centralized industrial policies we see now. So when I use a phrase like big government to refer to Hamilton, that means bigger than Jefferson's. But we're talking about in the late 1700s big government. There's nothing much for the government to do but collect excise taxes and keep a navy, and once in a while send maybe 2,000 men out west to fight some kind of war. There's just not much for it to do, of course. So the tension is good because the commercial society Hamilton envisions would allow a free marketplace of goods and ideas and that kind of competition, so that you don't have to be born into landed wealth like Jefferson was in order to succeed in America.
And become a yeoman farmer.
Yeah, so as elitist as Hamilton might have, as elitist as he was accused of by those like Jefferson and Madison who opposed him, it was really his ideas that would have allowed for more prosperity to be spread more widely just by allowing that opportunity.
Right. In fact, could you also speak to how simply because of his financial genius when he was Secretary of the Treasury, that lent to the expansiveness of American trade and free market tension?
Yes, so what productivity is what drives wealth and creates wealth. And this is something Hamilton realized by reading Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, which was published in 1776, the same year as another very important document that Jefferson wrote. And that idea, Hamilton read that. There were some things he rejected. He didn't like Smith's opposition to protection as much. But the idea of productivity and division of labor and where wealth really comes from, I mean, the title of Smith's book was on the origin and nature of the wealth of nations. Why are some nations wealthy? Why are other nations not wealthy? What are the reasons for it? And so what are the reasons for prosperity? What lies behind prosperity?
Tell us about, in terms of legislation and the enforcement of such legislation, the tension between the two.
In terms of
in terms of how they viewed government authority.
Oh, I see. So Hamilton thought, he said, look, in the Constitution, the U.S. Constitution, which was, of course, new at the time, says there's some things the government can't do. There's some things that the Constitution says the government must do. And in between that is a whole middle ground, and he suggested the U.S. government ought to dominate the middle ground. Jefferson's opinion was very different. Jefferson said if the Constitution does not say that you can do it, then you can't do it. And Washington was very scrupulous as the referee between these two, very scrupulous in doing exactly what the Constitution said to do. It said to get written opinions from the Secretaries of State and Treasury and War, so he got written opinions from them. It didn't say you have to meet them regularly. It didn't say you have to call them a cabinet. These were just things that sort of developed. But if the Constitution asked him to get their opinions, he got their opinions. And so, interestingly enough, when it would come to foreign policy, for example, Washington would ask Hamilton as well as Jefferson, even though Jefferson was Secretary of State. The U.S. Post Office started out in the State Department because Jefferson realized that Hamilton, by collecting excise taxes, would have an army of patronage in the U.S. government because of all the customs collectors. And so he wanted his own patronage too. So he thought, well, we don't have a lot of federal employees, but we'll have a post office. So this is why the post office was part of the State Department for so many years. They both kind of marshaled their armies together.
My guest is Dr. John Pinheiro. He's Director of Research at the Acton Institute. We're talking about the different views of government, or at least different paradigms as we know them. And some of you have heard of this, the Hamiltonian versus the Jeffersonian paradigms of government, and how they're held in healthy tension in the American Republic. We're continuing on the other side to also talk about some of the sources of the Declaration and the spirit of 1776. Stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter. And welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. I'm joined by Dr. John Pinheiro. Now, we were talking earlier about Hamiltonian versus Jeffersonian models and paradigms of government. I want to pick up from where we left off earlier, like you were mentioning about the way they viewed government, but to expand this a lot further into the Declaration proper and how there were different sources that influenced the way in which the Declaration was not only written up, but there was a thought process behind it.
Yeah, there's a lot of different ways people have viewed the Declaration of Independence, and its opening lines are very inspiring, and they have inspired people who are not Americans or around the world. In fact, of all people, Ho Chi Minh read this at the beginning of the communist revolutions in Vietnam, even. So this
John,
inspired in good ways and bad ways.
I grew up in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, and I memorized that preamble. So yes,
okay, But that's the part we usually remember. But over 2/3 of it was a long list of grievances. Mm-hmm. And the grievances were related to very specific common law violations that Parliament was accused of, that the Americans said, look, when our ancestors crossed the Atlantic or when we crossed the Atlantic, we didn't leave behind our liberties that we had under the law in England. We're still members of the British Empire. Yeah. You can't justly take these away. But what we should also know about the Declaration is Jefferson didn't write it to be a systematic treatise on government, the way somebody like John Locke wrote a treatise on government, or a political philosopher might write. This was to provide a rationale to the world that says, look, we're not just a bunch of tax evading smugglers. I would say they were, but they weren't just that, right? Yeah. We're not just tax evading smugglers, but here's why. Here's why we're protesting the taxes. Here's why we've been forced to smuggle so that we can trade with Spanish Florida without shipping our goods all the way to England so the corrupt members of Parliament can get a piece of the action before it's shipped all the way back. Here's why we're doing these things. And we don't change, you shouldn't change governments for light or transient reasons, he says, but we've had a long line of abuses, and that's why those grievances are so important. So I would encourage your listeners, your viewers, to read the whole Declaration, not just those opening lines, not just the opening paragraphs, but the grievances. They get so very specific. And of course, Jefferson wrote a much longer declaration, which was then edited by Congress, and they edited out some grievances. They changed certain words. Remember, he went out on a committee with John Adams and others to write the Declaration, but he was the primary writer, of course. There were over 100 local and state declarations of independence as well. So what we call the Declaration of Independence was the Congress's Declaration of Independence. And when Washington read it to the troops, it re-inspired them for a couple of years. It was a long haul. This was over a year into the war and 5 years before the fighting really stopped. So it's not like this came at the end of the war or the very beginning. So this was a very long process. So declaring independence was not a safe bet.
Yeah, it certainly wasn't. And those grievances are also so crucial because if we know our history and we go through that grievance, we're able to put ourselves in the heart of those who were at the forefront of this battle at the time. You think about the Sons of Liberty and what led them, what drove them into things like, say, the Tea Party, right? The fact of the matter is these were real human beings experiencing. They're not just facts we read in an historical novel. And there's a kind of crucial reality for us today as Americans to be immersed in that.
It's very easy to lose freedoms if you're not paying attention, or if you're only paying attention to yourself and not to yourself as a social being with a family and neighbors and just civil society. If you look in the Bill of Rights that was added to the Constitution, and if you look at the Constitution itself, you'll see a number of the things that were in those grievances, like the right to a speedy trial and the requirement for some evidence before you can be put in jail, habeas corpus, no taxation without representation. But all those things, interestingly enough, had been voiced against past kings in the 1600s, on back to 1215 with Magna Carta. So in some ways, I would argue that Jefferson's Declaration is not a radical document that's brand new, that springs out of nowhere, but it's very much a continuation of the English constitutional tradition when government had become tyrannical before, almost always the king in the past. When government had become tyrannical, Parliament, or in the case of Magna Carta, bishops and nobles, and the bishops come first in the Magna Carta when you read it, that's back in 1215. And they declare what their rights are so that there's a law that's higher than the king. It's a modern, almost secular concept to talk about the divine right of kings. I mean, that concept comes later. Before that, there's the church, there's the nobility, and there's the idea that there's a law that even the king can't break. Yeah. And it's not necessarily just divine law, but in England it was the common law, which was common to all. And if it's common to all, it's even common to the king. And these are the practice of those rights are what's being violated by Parliament. That's what the Americans are protesting.
I'm really glad you brought up the Magna Carta, because as soon as you mentioned habeas corpus, for example, we know that is a Magna Carta heritage. And so it is, like you said, there's a kind of radicalness to the declaration and the claims that it was making, but it wasn't made in frivolity, and there's a continued tradition that comes from English common law. Can you help us understand why that's significant for us as Americans to understand today?
The common law tradition.
Yeah,
so you think of right to trial by jury. Tocqueville said the most democratic thing about the United States and about the English common law as well was jury, because when you go to vote, your vote matters, but you're also voting with 150 million other people. Mm-hmm. But when you're on a jury, there's just 12 of you, and you hold somebody's life in your hands, and you have to take that very seriously. And that's just 12 to 1. The judge is there to be impartial. It's your fellow citizens who are really judging you on that jury. All of those tax laws that Parliament passed in the 1760s and 70s did away with jury trial and put people before military tribunals where you were guilty and you had to prove your innocence. Mm-hmm. And so those kinds of things are worth remembering. So I encourage Americans, when they get the jury summons in the mail, not to go, oh, no, I have jury duty. How am I going to get out of it? I'll say that I hate these people or those people, or I'll make something up. This is the most amazing democratic thing you can do. Yeah. You can think about it as a duty, but it's also a right. Mm-hmm. And usually we think, well, we have so many rights, we should talk about duties more often. In this case, look at it like you have a right to be on a jury. Mm-hmm. Easy for you to say, Pinheiro, you haven't served on a jury in years. They never let me, you know. but on the other hand, I think we don't want to lose sight of that. So Russell Kirk wrote some books called something like our English political heritage, and as somebody with no Anglo-Saxon background biologically, so to speak, I'm a great admirer of this heritage. This is part of the American heritage, but it's much more complex than that, of course. But common law still is important even today when it comes to legal decisions and Supreme Court thinking. And the reason is there's a conservative aspect to this law that says you're bound by what's gone before, so that you can't radically alter things. Yeah. And so the classic comparison is to compare the American Revolution, which is trying to preserve the way things have been in the freedoms, and Parliament is usurping that, with the French Revolution, that if you picture French culture, laws, everything is kind of a tree, and rather than trimming the tree so it grows more fully, they just cut it off at the base, try to replace it with new ideas, ideologies. Ideology was a term coined during the French Revolution to try to make sense of what the French were trying to do. That's a very different kind of revolution, and that's not respecting the past. And what we find is if you don't have respect for the past, you're not going to have any for the future, because someday you'll be the past of the future that is to come, and they're going to discard you as well. So you want to keep the big picture, like I would say we do in Catholic theology, with the living and the dead and the communion of saints. I mean, it's all, we're all existing together, right?
You just made everyone do mental gymnastics with that sentence.
I apologize.
No, but it was beautiful, and you're completely right. Of course, every time I talk with you, we only have 2 minutes left. So, okay, like you just juxtaposed what was happening with the American Revolution as within, if I may borrow from Ratzinger here, within a hermeneutic of, in this case, legal continuity and political continuity, versus a hermeneutic of complete
rupture.
Rupture, that was happening with the French Revolution. Can you therefore speak to the fact that virtue was still a driving force here? Yes. And intellectual consistency was still a driving force here, and we as Catholics ought to be appreciative of that.
Even the pagans who were like Cicero, who the founders read, knew that to have republican government you needed a virtuous population, because again, if you're going to have self-government, we have to be able to govern ourselves. A corrupt people will elect corrupt people to govern them. They will elect people who are going to give them things. who were going to promise them equality. Tocqueville says it's really easy to make people equal because I just take some of your stuff, Marcus, and give it to other people, and those other folks are immediately happy. And that was quick. But liberty is harder, and it takes longer, and it takes the virtues, not just virtue generally. So they knew that virtue is necessary. Most of the founders, in one way or the other, heterodox though some of them were in their Christian faith, knew that virtue issued from morality, that these things came from religion in some way or another. So this is what John Adams meant when he said our constitution's for a moral and religious people. What he meant was there's way too much freedom allowed in this constitution for an irreligious people because they'll just abuse it, and government will grow, and they'll grow more corrupt and inward turn. And I think that this is really what they meant.
About a minute left, or 30 seconds. If people want to learn more about this, and as Catholics especially, to gain a deeper appreciation of our inheritance, where do they go?
Well, there's a couple places. I'll recommend 2 books of my own, if that's okay. We have The American Experiment in Ordered Liberty, published by the Acton Institute, which looks at the American founding in light of Catholic social teaching, and I talk about its compatibility in that book. Not perfect compatibility. I mean, it's a rigorous assessment of the American founding ideals in light of Catholic social teaching. But I also edited a book with Dylan Pahman called The Christian Roots of American Liberty, and it's a reader, and there's the primitive Dominican constitutions in there, there's canons of the church, there's Juan de Mariana, the Spanish Jesuit in the 1600s, talking about no taxation without representation. And so we see that this wasn't just, these ideas on freedom weren't just creatures of the secular Enlightenment, but they have a pedigree going back even to the Desert Fathers, whom we also feature in that book.
Well, John, thank you so much. I've been talking with Dr. John Pinheiro, Director of Research at the Acton Institute, and we've been talking about, well, frankly, the intellectual, biblical, and therefore at the end Catholic heritages behind the American founding. Stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter.